Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the evaluation of state and local education programs and policies. We're going to be referring to this shorthand as state-local evaluation. For this year, this is one of two topics being competed under the Partnerships and Collaborations Focused on Problems of Practice and Policy Grant Program, CFDA 84.305H. My name is Sarah Brazel, and I'm a Program Officer from the National Center for Special Education Research. And I'm joined today by Alan Ruby, a Program Officer from the National Center for Education Research. I'll be doing the first half of the webinar, and then Alan will continue on with the next set of slides. This is an overview of what our webinar will cover today. I'm going to be discussing an overview of IES and its mission, the requirements for this grant program, some specifics about the purpose and the project narrative that you'll be writing, which includes the significance, partnership, research plan, personnel, and resources sections. I'll also talk about other important sections of the application, making sure that you are prepared and ready to submit your application. To begin, let's look at the legislative mission of IES, which is to describe the condition and progress of education in the United States, to identify education practices that improve academic achievement and access to education opportunities, and to evaluate the effectiveness of federal and other education programs. In this slide, you see the organizational structure of IES, with the Office of the Director and the National Board for Education Sciences at the top. In the two shaded boxes, you see the two research centers, National Center for Education Research and National Center for Special Education Research, and Alan and I are program officers in those centers. But there's also two other centers. We have the National Center for Education Evaluation, and they do contract evaluations. They also house the Regional Educational Laboratory Program, the What Works Clearinghouse, and the National Library of Education, ERIC. There's also NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, and they do national data and national surveys, the State Longitudinal Data Systems Grant Program. And then you'll also notice off to the side the Standards and Review Office, and they are responsible for peer review. In our National Center for Education Research and National Center for Special Education Research, we do research grants, and Alan and I are program officers. We are available to provide advice on application process and substantive research. The objective of the research grants is to answer 4 questions. What works to improve student educational outcomes so that we can disseminate it? What does not work so that we stop using it? What works for whom and where so we use it with the appropriate people in the appropriate places? And why does it work so we understand how to improve education and can build on this understanding? The director sets the Institute's priorities, which are also approved by the board. Partnerships have become a growing importance in these priorities in order to help focus research on the issues that most concern policymakers and practitioners, and to help researchers communicate their findings in useful ways. Policymakers and practitioners are to have a strong role through these partnerships in setting the research agenda, and there's to be consistent communication between the researchers and the practitioners on what is being found and what further research should be done. So let's get an introduction to the state and local evaluation topic. This evaluation of state and local education programs and policies needs to be a new or established partnership and carry out rigorous evaluations of education programs or policies from pre-K to adult education that are implemented by state or local education agencies. The partnership is composed of, at a minimum, of a research institution and a state or local education agency. The partnership is to evaluate a specific program or policy of high importance to the state or local education agency. For general requirements, this year IES has included a much stronger requirement regarding dissemination that includes both a dissemination plan and a data management plan. So I want to pay special note to that today in this presentation. Also, you need to focus on student education outcomes. Make sure there's a partnership between research institutions and state or local education agencies, which we're going to refer to as SEAs and LEAs. Evaluate SEA-LEA education programs and policies, and disseminate substantive findings and data analyses. And dissemination can occur throughout the partner education agency and its stakeholders, to other education agencies, and to researchers. The first requirement is for IES to focus on research that improves the quality of education for all students. Therefore, all our research must address the education outcomes of students. These student outcomes can be grouped under academic outcomes, as well as social and behavioral outcomes that support student success in school. An example of academic outcomes includes measures of academic achievement, such as test scores from a standardized test or research or developed tests, end-of-course exam, graduation required tests, or grades. Then there's also measures of academic progress that include course and grade completion, high school graduation and dropout, post-secondary access, progress, and completion. Social and behavioral outcomes can include, for example, social skills such as responsibility and cooperation, learning strategies such as goal setting, self-regulated learning, attitudes, for example, motivation or academic self-concept, and other behaviors such as attendance and discipline. These academic outcomes and social behavioral outcomes are for students from pre-kindergarten through post-secondary and adult education. You can address any grade or grade range within these boundaries. For example, focus on 5th grade or examine middle school. Look at transition between high school and college. These outcomes are for students without disabilities as well as students with or at risk for disabilities. If you're going to work with students with or at risk for disabilities, please take a look at the website posted here because there are specific requirements for how IES defines at risk. Applicants proposing to study children at risk for developing disabilities must present research-based evidence of an association between risk factors in their proposed sample and the potential identification of a specific disabilities. The determination of at-risk for disability status must be made on an individual child basis and may include, for example, factors used for moving children to higher tiers in a response to intervention model. The method to be used for determining if a child is at risk for developing a specific disability must be made explicit in the application and must be completed as part of the sample selection process. Evidence consisting of only general population characteristics, for example, labeling children as at risk for disabilities because they're from low-income families or English learners, is not sufficient for this purpose. In addition, applicants must identify the disability or disability categories that the sampled children are at risk of developing. IES also identifies the outcomes of interest that you would want to address by the age, grade, and education setting the students are in. For pre-kindergarten, the required outcomes are primarily those that would be considered school readiness, such as pre-reading, pre-language, vocabulary, early STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and the social behavioral competencies to actually engage in school. Research must address center-based pre-K programs. From kindergarten to grade 12, there are 2 categories of student outcomes: learning outcomes in the major academic subjects of reading, writing, and STEM, such as standardized test scores, end-of-course exams, exit exams, and grades. Also, there's progress in the education system, such as completing a course, completing a grade, being retained, graduating from high school, or dropping out. Both include the social skills, attitudes, and behaviors that support this type of learning and progress. Post-secondary education is defined as baccalaureate and sub-baccalaureate. The outcomes are access to, persistence in, progression through, and completion of the education program, often degree or certification programs. You may also examine the additional outcomes of achievement in reading, writing, English language proficiency, and mathematics for students in developmental education or bridge programs. Further, you may examine student achievement for all students in STEM courses that are a gateway to a STEM major and introductory English composition courses. And then we have adult education, students who are 16 years or above and outside the K-12 system are expected to be in such programs as adult basic education, adult secondary education, adult ESL, English as a second language, and high school equivalency test preparation, such as the GED, General Education Development Exam. For them, you can examine both access through completion, as well as achievement in reading, writing, English language proficiency, and math. There's also additional outcomes for students with or at risk for disabilities. Applicants are encouraged to also include outcomes accepted under the NICSR grant program, that's our National Center for Special Education Research, development outcomes for younger students, such as cognitive, communicative, linguistic, social, emotional, adaptive, functional, or physical development, and functional outcomes for older students that improve educational results and transitions to employment, independent living, and post-secondary education. You must include one or more of the previously discussed outcomes, but should also consider outcomes specifically for the student with disability population being studied. The second requirement is that the application must come from a partnership, which is a minimum of one research institution and one state or local U.S. education agency. The Institute does not endorse a specific model of research partnerships. However, the Institute views research partnerships as going beyond two common forms of collaboration between research institutions and educational agencies. For example, the researcher is hired by an educational agency to perform a specific research service and to report the results to the agency. Or the researcher has an initial research interest and obtains permission from the agency to carry out that research within the agency's schools. So we're expecting you would go beyond those kind of more typical researcher collaborations. Each must contribute at least one PI, which is a principal investigator, and they may contribute other co-PIs or co-investigators. There will be one PI or program director, and others would be co-PIs. The agency PI should have decision-making authority. They do not need to be the superintendent, but someone who oversees the policy or program and its implementation across the district or state. The logic here is that if decision makers are involved, they will have access to the research and be able to assure themselves of its quality and be more willing or able to make use of the results. It's important that you ask for a joint letter of agreement from the two or more organizations setting up the partnership. This is more like a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU. It shows both sides agree to the work proposed. Other members of the partnership can provide separate letters of agreement. Partnership may be new or existing, and when we talk about the research institution, it can have a broad definition, but important, they need to have the ability and capacity to conduct scientifically valid research. So when you're talking about a previous collaboration, it's stronger if it includes the same personnel, not only the same institution. And again, when we talk about the definition of research institution, we do mean it to be broad. So to be eligible to be the research institution partner, you have to show that the institution has the ability to do this type of research. It can include nonprofit and for-profit organizations, public and private institutions and agencies, for example, colleges and universities, and research firms. Now let's turn to the organizations that are eligible to serve as the SEA or LEA partner. This slide describes possible SEA partners. The examples are all eligible as long as they are overseeing some aspect of education: early learning, elementary, secondary, post-secondary, higher education, or adult education. Sometimes different types of public organizations are established to oversee a specific area of education. If there is any link to the main state education agency, it is helpful to include that agency as well. For this grant program, IES uses a broader definition than Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, which focuses on the primary agency responsible for supervision of public elementary and secondary schools. Turning to LEAs, there are a number of different organizations. For example, local education agencies, which are primarily public school districts. Individual schools or groups of schools that do not form a school district are not eligible to apply as the local education agency partner. It also can include community college districts or tribal education agencies. There are several types of organizations that can be useful partners but cannot serve alone as the agency partner. Intermediate districts, sometimes called service districts, that provide service to multiple districts but do not have decision-making authority over implementing programs and policies. However, they can serve as an agency partner if they do oversee the program or policy. Organizations that can be useful partners but cannot serve alone as the agency partner would be organizations made up of LEAs and sometimes other organizations such as universities or practitioners. For example, research and implementation networks that do not have decision-making authority over the implementation of policies and programs within the LEAs. They need to have some of the LEA members join as the education agency partner. And finally, non-public organizations that oversee or administer schools, such as education management organizations or charter management organizations. Those groups can be partners, but you must include the public, state, or district agency that oversees the schools that are involved. There are also some very small local education agencies, in some cases even having one school. These can apply as a partner, but the peer reviewers may consider that work less significant than projects involving multiple schools. And some additional partnerships for LEAs are state and city post-secondary systems. For example, a public post-secondary education system can apply as the education agency partner. If there is a state or city education agency that oversees the post-secondary system, the application will be stronger if they are also part of the partnership. A post-secondary system that applies as an education agency partner cannot also serve as the research institution partner in the same project. Adult education providers defined under WIAOA, which is Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, can serve as the partner when there is no state or local education agency for adult education. So I'm going to cover a couple examples. When we're looking at the state and post-secondary systems that can serve as education agency partners, however, an individual post-secondary education institution, like one campus, cannot serve as the agency. The whole system must sign on to the project. But the evaluation does not have to be across the whole system. It can take place at only some of the campuses. If there's an agency that oversees the post-secondary system, its inclusion will strengthen the application, and the post-secondary system cannot study themselves. One department or center cannot study another, or even the whole system. An outside institution must be involved. For example, RAND is studying development education programs across a number of Texas public 2- and 4-year post-secondary institutions in partnership with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and MDRC. And they're evaluating a developmental ed program with the City University of New York. Under Adult Ed, Title II of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act defines organizations eligible for federal funding as adult education providers, including community-based organizations, institutions of higher ed, public or non-profit for-profit agencies and libraries. So an example would be Penn State partnered with the Miami-Dade Public Schools, Chicago Citywide Literacy Coalition, and Houston Center for Literacy to examine adult education for low-skilled and immigrants. Some additional partners, one research institution and one state or local education agency is the minimum requirement for a partnership. Partnerships may include additional partners if they will increase the quality of the research. You'll want to show that additional partners have similar interests. For example, several education agencies may face a similar problem, or agencies located in a region, especially small districts, may share common interests. So it may make more sense to have a group of them come in together. Having multiple education agencies may also increase the significance of the proposed work. So an example would be an evaluation of middle school reading interventions that includes 6 Oregon LEAs attempting to address students with both reading and engagement problems. Intermediate or service districts often work with multiple LEAs by providing training or support for the program or policy being implemented, and so should be included in the project because of their implementation role. Similarly, some states or districts contract out the implementation of a program, and it's helpful to include the contract organization as a partner. For example, a project evaluated the impact of literacy training for pre-K teachers in Ohio, run by a contractor of the state. Non-education state and local agencies may also be useful partners, as long as the education agency is also a partner. If you're looking for a specific population, for example, foster children, the education agency would be a partner, but you also might want to include the social service agency that works with foster children. For example, a project combines the Connecticut Department of Education and the Connecticut Department of Justice and a university center on children, and they're examining education of court-involved youth. You can also include more than one research institution. Again, the point is to argue that they have shared interests and will make a unique contribution to the work. Non-research organizations are often part of the partnership for many reasons, including their interest in the issue, their access to data, being a provider of services, and having a link to the community and other organizations. For example, a project seeking to link early childhood education with kindergarten has the United Way as a partner because of its role in supporting early childhood education in the district and its link to stakeholders. But there's an issue. As you have more partners, coordination becomes difficult, so it's important to address how the partnership will work together, keep in contact, and make decisions. The one type of partnership that I would not recommend is the inclusion of multiple education agencies whose only similarity is that they have worked with the same research institution, rather than having a shared common education issue or problem. The third requirement is to evaluate an SEA or LEA program or policy, and it should be of high importance to the education agency. It should be substantial modification of the agency's practice or of other agencies' practice, and it should be a program or policy adopted by the SEA or LEA because they have the final authority over its use. They may implement or they may have contracted out its implementation, but they have decided it should be implemented and they retain control over its implementation. So a key point is it's not to be a researcher's intervention that the agency is allowing to be tried out in their district or state. Our other research grant programs, 305A and 324A, would support that kind of work. And peer reviewers are quick to pick up on this distinction and will often lower a score for an application because it seems to be of greater interest to the researcher than the education agency. Also, the program or policy is implemented as everyday practice, not receiving additional support or limited to a select population, as in the case of a pilot test. Again, our other research grants, 305A and 324A, would be more appropriate for those kinds of studies. Again, a new requirement this year is that you need to have a dissemination plan. Applicants must describe their plans to disseminate the findings from their project in Appendix A of their application. Dissemination through the partner agency is important, such as an agency-wide oral briefing, a free non-technical written brief available to the public. Also, dissemination to other education agencies, such as presentations at practitioner and policymaker meetings and publications in practitioner and policymaker journals. Also, dissemination to the research community through academic presentations and publications in peer-reviewed journals. Because state and local evaluations provide findings of a causal nature, all types of findings from these projects are expected to be potentially useful to researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and public, including findings of beneficial impact on students and findings of null or negative impacts. So it's important when writing an application that education agency understands that all findings are to be released. Right of first review, no surprises is helpful, but findings cannot be withheld. The education agency has to want to learn from the project. Because of the value of the findings, the Institute expects projects to carry out broad dissemination to multiple audiences. And see these audiences again that I discussed in the slide. Dissemination products should also be placed on ERIC. The data management plan is to allow access to the project's data by others in order to support reanalysis, replications, and allow analyses for other purposes or combination of data sets. Projects should describe the data they are collecting and how they will be made available for others. For example, final data set, documentation, who will hold the data for at least 10 years and determine its release, how the data will be maintained and released if held at the PI's institution and the PI leaves. Multiple approaches can be used. Some institutions have already set up data archives and charge the project a % of the grant to maintain and provide access to the data. Some projects have turned their data over to central repositories, such as ISR at the University of Michigan. In all cases, projects can charge for this work and should budget for it. Some data may be easier to release. For example, projects collected implementation and outcome data, while some data may have prohibitions on its release. For example, some states do not allow the release of student outcome data collected in administrative data systems. For data that cannot be released, projects should describe how they will provide a description of how the data were obtained, what was requested from the state administrative data system, how the data set was created, such as merging of data from different systems, how it was cleaned, what variables were created, and data analyzed. In short, the process to obtain the data and the code for recreating the data and its analyses. It's really important to check the fit of your research and the state and local evaluation grant program. If you're not looking at student outcomes, then IES is not the appropriate funding agency for your research. If you need time and effort to build a partnership and carry out initial research in preparation for an evaluation, consider the Researcher Practitioner Partnership Program under the 84305H. If the program or policy you want to evaluate is not implemented by or of high importance to the SEA or LEA, consider our other research grant programs, such as the Education Research Grant Program 84.305A, or Special Education Research Grant Program 84.324A. That is the end of this first part of the webinar, and Alan is going to be continuing on with the second part of the webinar.
Hi everyone, this is Alan Ruby joining the webinar at this point. I'm the program officer for this grant topic from the National Center for Education Research. I'm just going to reiterate the whole section Sarah just went over one more time, and then we'll go into the actual sections of the research narrative that you'll be writing in your application. So the purpose of the State and Local Evaluation Grant Program is to promote joint evaluation research by research institutions and state and local education agencies. So you're to focus on a specific education program or policy of key importance to the agency, And your application must identify this program or policy you intend to evaluate. So we have in the past received applications that say that the actual program to be evaluated will be determined after the grant is received, and that is not responsive to the request for applications. Your evaluation should contribute directly to state or district decision making. How the state or district will use the findings from the evaluation to make changes in the programs. It may be to reform the program, revise it, adapt it, broaden it in some cases, or reduce its use. And the review panel will often comment on this issue. If they don't see how the proposed findings will help the SCA or LEA make a decision, they will find the research less significant. There is also an intent that this grant program will foster longer-term research partnerships. They may be on the same type of programs or different programs, but the idea is that after working together successfully, the state and the research institution would be interested in doing further similar type work or additional type work. For example, a grant between the Michigan Department of Education, the University of Michigan, and Michigan State University has led to the creation of the Michigan Consortium for Education Research, which has developed new research ideas and obtained funding from multiple sources to continue carrying out joint research on issues important to the state. So again, what the partnership is going to do during this grant program is identify the education program or policy of high priority to the agency that will or is intended to improve student education outcomes, and to evaluate its overall impacts on student outcomes, along with any intermediate impacts, as well as to evaluate impacts by important subgroups. Also, to look at the fidelity of implementation, which is often some of the most immediately useful information for the state or local education agency, as they are allowed to revise implementation, and to identify the cost of the programs. Past projects have covered a wide range of programs and policies. IES has made 22 state and local awards. The projects range from looking at expanded pre-kindergarten, professional development program for teachers, gifted education, dual language immersion, student retention policies, more rigorous academic high school curricula, and state high school exams, and state mentoring for college enrollment. So IES is not concerned with any specific area of education. Its concern is that important programs and policies are being evaluated so that state and local education agencies can make decisions based on the evidence from these evaluations. IES expects certain products to come out of the grant, primarily the evidence on the fidelity of implementation of the program or policy so that the state or district can improve implementation, the causal evidence of the impact of the program or policy on student educational outcomes, both overall impacts and impacts under a variety of conditions or by subgroup. And then there may be conclusions on and revisions to the theory of change that guide the program or policy. And these will contribute to our understanding of educational process and procedures and how to develop and implement future education interventions. If a beneficial impact is found, then the evidence will support the continuation of the program or policy and perhaps promote its use by other districts or states. To this end, the project should be identifying tools, procedures, and supports used to foster full implementation. If a beneficial impact is not found, you'll want to examine possible reasons. Was it due to poor implementation? Did the program or policy not work as theorized? Were there other obstacles to the success of the program? And then whether it is worth revising this program, policy, or implementation in order to lead to future success. One of the benefits for the state or district under this grant program is you can give immediate feedback to the state or district as the evaluation continues. The purpose is both to learn about the intervention, but also to inform the state or the district so that improvements can be made. And this is a key part of your dissemination. One other expected product is that your determination of the financial cost of the program or policy. That includes both the startup and maintenance costs, so that other states and districts can understand how much it would take to implement such a program or policy and base their decisions on the cost needs as well. So let's move now to the project narrative. This is the part of your application where you discuss your proposed work and capacity to carry it out. And this is the section that the peer reviewers focus on. It contains 5 sections. Each section will receive a score by the peer reviewers, and then the overall application will receive a score. Under each of these 5 sections, you'll notice there are both requirements and recommendations. The requirements are the minimal needed to be considered responsive to the RFA and for your application to be accepted for peer review. The recommendations are what the peer reviewers are asked to use to rate the quality of your application as they score it. So let's start with the significance section. In the significance section, you are justifying the importance of the evaluation. So the first step is to describe the education program or policy you intend to evaluate, going through its components, the processes and materials that will support implementation, evidence that it's ready to be or already implemented, and how it may differ from practice in the same location or in some other area. The program or policy must be implemented by the education agency. That means it must be under the control of the education agency and specifically endorsed by the education agency as an agency program or policy. In other words, the agency may directly implement the program or it may contract it out to someone else to implement it, but it is considered an agency program. This is to distinguish this grant program from our regular grant programs that will support the evaluation of a researcher who may be evaluating their own program with the permission of a state or district. If the program or policy is to start next school year, you should provide evidence that it will start, i.e. that there is funding available to start it, that there's the legal authority, that there is an office overseeing its implementation, and identify those who will implement it. In addition, you should note for its implementation where it is to be implemented, who it is to address, and that is to be implemented under fairly routine conditions, that we are not doing extra support that a state or district will not be able to continue in the future. If you're evaluating a program that is receiving such extra support, you should apply under the 305A or 324A grant programs under Goal 3, which the efficacy goal, which allows extra support to be provided. You should note the theory of change for how this intervention, program, or policy is to affect changes that lead to beneficial impact on student outcomes. The theory of change may not be as well developed as a researcher-developed intervention, but there should be an underlying logic to it. And you can use a logic model to diagram this process. The rationale for testing this education program or policy may differ based on the program or policy you're looking at. You may be working with a widely used program or policy, but there is no evidence yet of its efficacy. Or you may be focusing on a specific component of the program or policy that can be tested on its own. You may be looking at an intervention that has been evaluated in the past, but now you're able to use a much more rigorous design to test it. And you may be looking at a program or a policy that has a quite established history in this SEL or LEA, but is very different than those being used in other SE or LEAs, so it would have wide interest in its success or lack of success. So we'll move on now to the partnership section. You want to describe who is in the partnership and why are they being included. how they came together to propose this project. Both the management structure and data are very important concerns to reviewers. For management, there should be a clear delineation of responsibilities for everyone, how the partners will work together, especially in complicated partnerships, and that the education agency has an ongoing role throughout the evaluation, even if in parts it's just an advisory role. It should not just be consulted at the start and then at the end. For data, where will the data be kept? If it's not in the agency, will the agency have easy access even after the project ends? And who else will have access to the data? And who will make these access decisions? For example, will outside researchers be allowed to address the data or request the data? There is an opportunity here to place researchers in the SCA or LEA to help develop the data system. This may be a further benefit to the agency by creating a stronger or more useful data than was in existence before, as well as to helping build the partnership. In the partnership section, there is also a partnership development plan. Part of this is to describe how the partnership will make decisions. So how will decisions be made regarding research direction, capacity building, discussion of results and release of results, and the development of future research plans? How will the project increase the agency's ability to participate in and use research? IES expects that the joint work to be done under these projects, from developing the research questions, implementing the data collection, reviewing findings, and proposing further analyses, all the way through dissemination, will build this capacity in the agency. Agencies do have different capacities in the regard to research use and participation, and so may propose different goals. IES is not expecting that the agency will end up being able to do its own research unless that is a goal stated in the application for the agency. Sometimes the project will also carry out specific work for use for the agency partner, e.g. developing new data sets, generating administrative reports, generating school-level data for use by the district and school teams, and these can be funded under this grant program, as they both help the district build its capacity and also build the partnership. So next we'll turn to the research plan. We're going to walk through a set of issues that are to be addressed in your research plan. For example, you should start with your research questions and hypotheses, and then describe the sample and setting. You want to define the population that you're looking at and how your sample and sampling procedures will allow inferences to the population. This includes exclusion and inclusion rules and their justification, strategies used to increase participation and reduce attrition, and then describing how the setting also has implications for the generalizability of the study. You want to go over your research design. You want to have strong research designs that can be used to make causal inferences, drawing conclusions on whether the intervention will work. If your design has a weakness, you should openly discuss its internal validity, because reviewers will know these researchers and will want to see whether you are open about them. You want to discuss how you will determine equivalence at baseline, even if you're doing an experiment. You want to include a check for bias that may come from attrition, either overall or differential. By doing these things, and if the design is implemented correctly, you should be able to meet the What Works Clearinghouse evidence standards. IES-funded evaluations are automatically submitted to the WWC for evaluation of the quality of the evidence provided by their design and its implementation. It would be worth taking a look at the WWC evidence standards, and the website is given in the request for applications. The preferred design is a randomized controlled trial. The type of RCT design you use will lead to different design challenges. For example, if all schools within the agency are mandated to be in the experiment, there may be some resistance by some of the schools. either to the treatment, leading to lower fidelity, or to the control, leading to attempts to actually gain something similar as the program or policy being implemented. If volunteers are used for the design, there may be problems retaining the comparison group or keeping them from seeking the intervention or a similar one on their own. In a social and character development study funded by IES, it was found that the majority of the control group had gone out and identified curriculum to support social and character development on their own, leading to very low differences between the treatment and control group. If lotteries are used, similar to volunteers, lottery applicants may want in, and therefore they may leave the study to seek intervention. This often raises issues of differential attrition, leaving the less motivated behind in the control group. In some cases, there may be ways to follow leavers. For example, in a study in Portland on dual language schools, the study obtained state-level data to track some of the control group which had left Portland to seek other opportunities. You may be able to use a staggered rollout in which this treatment group receives the treatment for a year or two first, and then the control group receives the intervention later on. In such cases, you want to make sure there's enough time for the intervention to be well implemented and have an impact on students. For example, some programs or policies may take 2 to 3 years before they're expected to have an impact on students. If the control group is to receive the same program or policy within a year, it may not be a very fair test of the intervention. Finally, there may be variations in the program or policy provided, and this may be more acceptable to the education agency and the schools, because both are receiving some sort of treatment, though they may differ in certain components. In such cases, it's important enough that the differences are worth evaluating. For example, in Tennessee, one component of a statewide teacher evaluation program, teacher mentoring, which has not been widely distributed, is being evaluated in this way using a randomized control design. As noted, if a program or policy has been implemented statewide, it's not likely to be able to be evaluated using a randomized control trial. Randomized control trials may be more applicable to the rollout of new programs or policies or components of program or policies that are not yet widely used. If an RCT is not possible, you'll want to justify in your application why this is so, and then discuss an alternative research design that minimizes selection bias. So, for example, you might propose a regression discontinuity design. Here it's important to check that the assignment variable is not being manipulated. We have had, for example, evaluations of gifted program or magnet school enrollment based on IQ tests, and these studies have found that the IQ test was being manipulated, at least for higher SES students. So you will want to check the possibility of manipulation beforehand if possible in order to convince the peer review panel that your RDD won't suffer from this problem. You may also consider other well-designed quasi-experimental designs. For example, comparative interrupted time series may be strong. Typical matching designs that only use commonly available variables such as race, ethnicity, gender, free reduced lunch are often not considered strong enough by the peer reviewers because they are not seen as being able to control for unobserved factors or explain selection bias. They can be strong enough, though, if your data has enough unique variables to help you predict enrollment or selection. Also important for both RCTs and quasi-experimental designs is describing how the education agency will understand the importance of following design and not violating some of the requirements of it. For example, in an RDD study done in Oregon, the research institution actually sent the methodologist into the schools to discuss the importance of sticking to the cutoff point in order to maintain a sharp cutoff there. And in addition, the project then allowed schools to select a small number of students to assign them to the treatment or control based on teacher in decision making rather than the strict cutoff. These students were not used in the analysis, and they were small enough not to affect the results, but they did reduce the pressure on the project from teachers and parents to include students or not include students in this particular intervention. You'll want to describe the statistical power and the methods you use to calculate them, including all the assumptions. Adequate power will avoid the issue that if you do not find a statistically significant result, it is not because your sample size was too small. You should describe the power analysis in detail because during the review, some of the reviewers will actually redo your power calculations, and they will report out whether or not they could replicate them. You'll want to provide the power analysis not only for your main impact analysis, but for any confirmatory subgroup analyses as well. You'll also want to describe the practical meaning of your minimum detectable effect size you identify. You want to justify that such a change in the outcome will matter. If you have a very high minimal detectable effect size, the peer reviewers may be skeptical that such a large impact can be found, but this may be tempered if the practical change is not that great that it represents. On the other hand, if you have a very low minimal detect effect size, there may be questions about does it really represent an important change in the outcome, and if not, your study may seem to be overpowered. You want to describe your outcome measures, and you want to include outcome measures that are relevant to state, district, and school decision making. For example, end-of-course exams and standardized test exams, grades, promotion rates, retention rates, high school graduation rates, discipline referrals, special education placements, college enrollment, and completion rates. You'll want to describe the reliability and validity and appropriateness of your measures, and you'll want to show how well they fit into your theory of change. You'll also want to describe some of the intermediate outcomes that are to occur before you reach your final student outcomes. And so, for example, in an evaluation of a Florida high school program that was to identify and better prepare 11th grade students so that they could take remediation course in 12th grade rather than in college, the intermediate outcome was that they actually took such remediation coursework in math and English in 12th grade. The study found that when this overall program was enacted, it was first enacted as a volunteer program, and there was hardly any intermediate effect. Very few schools were offering the 12th grade remediation courses, and very few students were taking it, so it was unlikely to have an impact on the final outcome of reduced remediation course taking in college. However, the program did become a mandated program, and 12th grade course taking increased so that the analysis could then take a look at the final outcomes. You may want to look at moderators and mediators. In part, this is addressed by differential outcomes by subgroup and by site. You want to describe how they'll be measured in both the treatment and control. And you may be doing an exploratory or a confirmatory analysis of them, and you should describe, as noted before, if you're doing confirmatory analysis, you should include a power analysis, and then include an analysis plan for them. Just as an example, an evaluation of the Massachusetts high school graduation tests found that they had overall no impacts on student college going, on high school graduation and college going, but they did have negative impacts on low SES students because those students who failed were less likely to retake the test, while higher SES students were more likely to take the test, thereby complete high school and go on to college. IES recommends that these evaluations use mixed methods combining both quantitative and qualitative work. The qualitative work is often very important to understand the causal explanations, to understand the fidelity of implementation, and to look at intermediate outcomes and mediators. And so we recommend that you have a team capable of doing both quantitative and qualitative research. Just some examples of how this work has helped. In a study in Portland of dual language immersion, there were differences in the benefits of dual language immersion based on the language of immersion. And what was found is that in classroom observations and teacher interviews, that teaching materials were much more available for Spanish immersion than for the other languages, therefore allowing greater use of the partner language for the Spanish classrooms. Oftentimes, if we only have quantitative research, we often end up with projects that find no overall impacts, but impacts for specific subgroups. And the research design may not have been designed to do a causal analysis for those subgroups. If there's no qualitative research to try to understand why those subgroups showed some signs of impact, really only what occurs is speculation, rather than actually going in to understand why one group was affected and another was affected. So for example, a study in New Hampshire looking at a program to improve college going by high school seniors found impacts on girls but not boys. And it would have been a perfect time to have followed up with a qualitative look at why girls reacted in the way they did and boys did not react to the intervention. Unfortunately, the project did not include such work, and it sort of fell back on such explanations as labor market opportunities for boys versus girls without being able to really determine if that was the reason for the difference. Evaluations are weaker when there isn't a good examination of how well the intervention is being implemented and what the comparison group is receiving, which usually requires qualitative work, and we'll talk about that in the next slide as well. Your research plan should have how to examine fidelity of implementation. You don't want to end up with a study that says we found no impact, but we found low fidelity, because then you're kind of stuck between was the reason for no impact because the intervention didn't work or because it wasn't implemented. So in the first year of these grant programs, there really should be an initial fidelity study to check if fidelity is high enough to expect an impact, or perhaps if it's not, the state or local agency should focus on improving fidelity before the evaluation continues. This information is often of great use to the agency because it can come very quickly, and it can actually convince the agency, on the other hand, that the study is worthwhile. For example, in an ongoing project in Tennessee looking at a dual credit high school math class, there was some skepticism that a short teacher PD being provided to the teachers of this dual credit class could actually change instruction and curriculum. By doing a very quick syllabus review of the intervention classes, major differences were found between the treatment classes, the dual credit classes, and the regular high school math classes. And this has given the whole study much greater credibility because there obviously is some difference being evaluated here. One other issue regarding fidelity implementation concerns interventions that include a training component. For example, if you have a program to train teachers, or even more complicated, you have a program to train a trainer who then goes out to train teachers to do something different in the classroom, many studies will only focus on the fidelity of what's going on in the classroom. But that's not enough. We need to step back and say, was the training fidelity high too? Because if the training fidelity was poor, we wouldn't expect the teachers to learn enough to go back and change their classroom instruction. So the conclusion we would draw in that case was it wasn't a teacher fidelity issue, it was a trainer fidelity issue. And then thinking about a trainings intervention, you've got to go back even one step further to look at how was the training of the trainers and their fidelity when they go on to train the teachers themselves. What is occurring in the comparison group is also important to understand why an intervention may or may not have an impact on student outcomes. So you want to describe who makes up your comparison group, how are they similar or different from the treatment group, what are they expected to receive in place of the treatment, are they receiving something similar or not, and if so, how much are they receiving? In some cases, showing a clear treatment contrast leads you to more support for your results. For example, in a study of pre-K in Tennessee, more than half the control group were not involved in a formal pre-K program. They were at home or some other child care. This would be expected to give a very different experience than the treatment students who were in pre-kindergarten. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, in a social and character development study, the control group teachers reporting almost as high rates of implementing some sort of social and character developed intervention, though not the same one as used in the treatment group, which could have been a partial explanation for why no differences were found in student outcomes. You want to describe your data analyses procedures, describe your model, include the equations, explain the variables you'll be including and the coefficients of interest and the software you'll use to estimate the models. The outcomes of the analysis should clearly give you answers that address your research questions. Again, you want to show all your analyses, not only those for the main impact, but for any subgroup, moderator, or mediator analyses, as well as your fidelity of implementation analyses. Finally, you want to describe how you will identify the costs of the intervention. You don't have to include the costs up front in your application. What you include is a plan for how you'll determine their costs. And these are both the startup cost and the maintenance costs. This work is to provide the information that other states or districts would need to determine if they could afford to implement the intervention. If you want to go further and do a cost effectiveness or cost benefit analysis, that is also fine under this grant program. Now let's turn to the personnel and resources sections of the application. In the personnel section, you're going to identify all the key personnel on the projects. Just a reminder that the PI can come from either the research institution or the education agency. Either is fine. IES does not recommend one or the other. It's really which is best for the study to be carried out. But there must be a PI from one and a co-PI from the other institution. And the co-PI or PI from the education agency should have decision-making authority over the program or policy being evaluated. That doesn't mean they have to have the final decision-making authority. It doesn't have to be the superintendent of the district, but they should have an active role in overseeing the implementation of the program or policy and contributing to decisions on its implementation and continuation. So one way to think about this section is think about all the work you are promising to do, identify each person, their expertise or experience to do that work, and their time on the project to do that work. So you may want to write in your section or sentences in kind of the following approach. So-and-so is an experienced and an expert in survey methodology as shown by his work on 3 previous projects and these 6 co-publications. They will be in charge of the survey we are doing with students, and they are on the grant for 10% of the time, which is enough time to oversee the development, implementation, and analysis of the survey results. In sum, in this section, you want to identify what work is to be done, who will do it, that they have the expertise and experience to do it, and that they have the time to do it. And you may want to orient the biosketches in the same way. In addition, because these are partnership grants, it's helpful to describe anyone who has experience working in this type of partnership before, as well as having their research expertise. These are normally large grants, so the PI should have experience managing a grant of this size and complexity. There should always be at least one key person with enough time to keep the partnership work on track, and consider the objectivity of the personnel. Developers or distributors of any interventions, they may be on the project to look at things such as implementation fidelity, but they should be kept separate from the impact evaluation work. In the resources section, you're going to describe the institutional resources that are being brought to the partnership, how they will support both the partnership and the research. Important here is having the joint letter of agreement by the major partners that clearly sets out their expected roles and responsibilities. And also, in addition, is describing not only the resources to carry out the project, but also the resources to disseminate the results. If schools and districts are taking part, it's more helpful if you can have some letters of agreement from them as well. If secondary data is being analyzed, it's very important to have letters from whoever is holding that data saying they will provide it for use in the study. If there are district or school staff or even students or parents taking part through surveys, observations, or logs, it's important to discuss how their cooperation will be obtained. For example, will you use incentives? Will other personnel be brought on to try to encourage them to take part? For example, letters from principals or letters from the state superintendent supporting the work being done. In addition, you should describe the resources to implement the dissemination plan, which is in Appendix A. You may have members of your team with experience for different types of dissemination, and you may have specific partners or offices that are joined on to the project because of their dissemination expertise. Often universities may have a dissemination office, or research firms may have a dissemination office as well. In addition to the research narrative, there are the appendices that the peer reviewers may take a look at. These are the budget and the budget narrative. We'll go through those. And Appendix A is the new requirement this year. So I want to repeat this information that was presented by Sarah. And in it, you are to disseminate your findings throughout the partner agency. And for example, through an agency-wide oral briefing or a free non-technical written brief. Just an example from the Oregon study I mentioned, they would hold a summer conference bringing together the schools and districts to go over the results that they found from each year and to plan for how the evaluation can continue in the next year. And that way, the overall agency partner, the district level partner, saw how their schools were doing. Their schools saw how they were doing, were able to make adjustments as well. And this led to some interesting interaction among the schools and among the schools and their districts. In addition, you want to discuss dissemination to other educational agencies that may be interested in this program or policy, and you may want to disseminate to the research community. So the latter two can be done through presentations at both practitioner and academic conferences, as well as publications in practitioner and peer-reviewed journals. Appendix B is required for resubmissions. You should discuss how you responded to reviewer comments, and it's very important to respond to all comments. If you feel your application has changed so much it's no longer a resubmission, you can argue that point in this section and discuss why the changes are so great and why previous reviews are not applicable. Appendix C is optional. It is to include materials that relate to your evaluation and to the partnership. For example, diagrams of the partnership management structure, data tables on the state or local education agency, data tables that will be filled in by the evaluation, a timeline, examples of the measures you'll use to do focus groups or interview protocols or any researcher or practical tests being given. Practical in the sense that they're given by the state or local education agency. But do not include narrative text in this appendix. Appendix D is also optional. This is to provide materials regarding the program or the policy. If it's a curriculum, there may be curriculum materials. If it's a professional development program, you may include some training documents and the like. So these are materials that relate to the education program or policy being evaluated. So the difference between Appendix C and Appendix D is that Appendix C contains measures and information you are using in your evaluation, while Appendix D contains measures and materials being used in the program or policy you are evaluating. Again, do not include narrative text in Appendix D. Appendix E is required. This is where you put your letters of agreement from the research partners. We encourage letters from multiple organizations, the joint letter from the key partners, other letters from supporting partners, letters from consultants or districts and schools, and letters from those holding data that is going to be made available to the project. Very important to put in specific details in these letters. What are the roles and responsibilities of the person signing the letter, and that they agree to carry it out. Appendix F is a data management plan. This is a new requirement for the evaluation of state and local programs and policies. You're to lay out what data are being collected, and of that data, what data will be shared, how that data will be shared, what is the form of the data set and the documentation provided, how that data will be maintained, and then for data that can not be shared, let's say, for example, a state has allowed you to use administrative data on student outcomes but does not give you permission to share that data outside the project. In such a case, you should propose how others could obtain that data, clean it, analyze it, to do exactly what you've done to allow your work to be redone and reanalyzed. Again, this is a new requirement, and applications will not be sent forward for peer reviewed if the data management plan is missing. Then there's a budget and a budget narrative. So these grants can last a maximum of 5 years. Their maximum award is $5 million, but there is a key constraint on the award. It can only be used for evaluation. It cannot be used for implementation of the program and policy. The award size doesn't need to be anywhere near as large as this. We've had grants down in the hundreds of thousands doing these awards. It really depends on your project scope. The budget narrative is a very important place to lay out how the funds are to be used. For example, if you discuss that you're going to do a survey somewhere in your research narrative, survey usually won't show up in the budget. There's no place line item for that, but in your narrative you might point out the survey is being supported through personnel, through equipment, and through materials for these purposes, to write the survey, to pilot test the survey, to carry out the survey, to analyze the survey. There is no requirement that the award be equally divided up between the partners. However, there is always a concern that state or local agency should have a role in this grant, and that's sometimes difficult to argue if there is no state or local agency personnel being supported by the grant. It may be the case that an education agency is not administratively set up to receive and report on grant funds or use funds in a specific way, such as hiring someone or travel. If this is the case, you should just come out and state that clearly in the application, that the funds are primarily going to the research institution because the state or district is not set up to use grant funds, and that the research institution will provide funds to the state or district in certain ways, such as hiring personnel for the state or paying for travel of the co-PI on the grant to come to the IES PI meeting or to other presentations. It's just be very clear how the funding is being used and describing it in the budget narrative. What you don't want to look like is as if the research institution is being contracted. If the education agency is receiving the grant, there should be a subaward to the research institution clearly laying out all the work being done, And conversely, if the research institution is receiving the grant, there should be a sub-award to the agency and to any other partners, of course, laying out what work will be done by them. The important dates and deadlines are listed in the request for application. First would be the letter of intent. You submit it electronically, laying out who the partnership is, what is the work you intend to do. The program officers use these to give you some feedback on your research idea, and the Standards and Review Office uses them to estimate how many grant applications will come in and what topic areas are being addressed, and this helps them in planning the peer reviewers. The information on a letter of intent does not play any role in the actual review. All information on the letter of intent is superseded by your application. So the reviewers do not see the letter of intent, they only see your application. So if your ideas change between the time of letter of intent and the application submission, that is not a problem. The application package will be posted on grants.gov at about the same time the letter of intent is due, and then there is an application deadline, date given, and a time given. That time has normally been 4:30 p.m. with 0 seconds, and the 0 seconds is a real deadline. Try to avoid submitting on the day the application is due because the server is very slow. Also, if you submit early, there is software that checks for mistakes. If you have a mistake, you will then be notified, and you can be notified, and you'll have time to upload a corrected application so that is accepted for review. When thinking about possible start dates in the past, they've ranged between July and September. And it may not be most beneficial to start at the earliest start date. It may be most people are on vacation in the summer or early summer, so that's wasted time if you start then. Or it may be that some personnel, be they graduate students or postdocs, won't be available early in the summer. On the other hand, if an early summer start, people are around and you can do some pre-work before the evaluation begins, it's perfectly reasonable to start as soon as possible. This slide lays out some of the sources for information. The request for application is on the IES website. Abstracts of projects can be found on the grant search engine on the IES website. Under program, put in evaluation of state and local to get a listing of projects that have been funded under this grant program. The actual application package you'll fill out comes from the website for grants.gov. And then Sarah and my emails, feel free to contact us. Sarah, as mentioned before, works with the National Center for Special Education, so she is most interested in projects doing research on students with or at risk for disability, while I work primarily with projects for general education students. If accepted, your application then goes to the Standards and Review Office for peer review. They first do 2 screenings. One is a compliance screening to see that you were responsive to the requirements. As I mentioned, under the 5 sections of the research narrative, each section lays out requirements, and so they will check that you have met those requirements. If found compliant and responsive, your application will be assigned to a review panel. 2 to 3 reviewers will take a first look. One will be a methodologist in the research design you're proposing. The other should have knowledge of the substantive issue you're looking at. If they feel it is a strong proposal, it will be forwarded on to the full panel, which will be reviewed in person. And many panelists on that panel will not be experts in that specific program or policy. And so they will be generalist education. They have some other area they are focused on. So you need to write your application both for the initial 2 to 3 reviewers who have greater expertise in that area, as well as more generalists in the area of education research and evaluation. However, the panel will include experts in probably all the relevant methodologies you propose, RCT, RDD, focus groups, surveys, and the like. So it's important that if you propose any specific sub-study or sub-method, that you provide enough detail that an expert in it would feel comfortable that you are carrying it out correctly. As mentioned, you will get a score on each section of your research narrative as well as an overall score on your application. You'll set up an account on the application notification system and then receive an email that the status of your award and the reviewer statements have been posted there. If you do not receive an award the first time, we definitely suggest you talk to your program officer and consider resubmitting, as the majority of grants provided come to resubmissions. So let me thank you again for listening to the webinar. Both Sarah and I are quite available to talk with by email or set up a phone conversation to discuss your research idea and whether it fits under this grant program. Thank you. Bye-bye.